Hi, Vanessa.
Hey, Dom. How you doing?
Decent.
Do you want me to just not ask you that question?
I hate fake answering this question.
Okay.
And I rarely have a podcast-friendly answer.
Okay. Hey, Dom.
Hey, Vanessa.
It's hard, see?
Yeah. What do you do now? Well, welcome to Uncertain Things,
Welcome to Uncertain Things, the podcast.
the podcast for the melancholy and somber.
Mm-hmm.
Brooding hum. Well, today we are thrilled to have Nicholas Christakis, Yale professor of evolutionary biology, who wrote Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, and more recently, Apollo's Arrow, the profound and enduring impact of coronavirus on the way we live. We spent a good 2 hours talking and meandering about a whole weird eclectic mixtape worth of topics, from the asymmetrical relationship between celebrities and their fans, the way that coronavirus exposed the fragility of our institutions and specifically of the scientific citadel. And, being uncertain things, this led us to discuss the broader crisis in truth-seeking and truth-disseminating systems in our deeply cherished liberal world, something that we certainly, and I believe most of our audience, care deeply about. I also couldn't resist talking about the infamous YouTube video of Christakis from almost 6 years to the day when he was standing in the quad making the case for not just the right of students and professors to hold bad or unloved opinions, but also, if you go back and watch it, you'll see him actually making the case for Blueprint, his book, in so many words. The idea that humans share certain core ideas about what makes a good or just community. So it's that idea that we ended up spending most of the time discussing, and specifically the idea that he propounds in Blueprint about the social suite.
Right, the social suite. From my understanding, it's like the almost universal characteristics that humans have developed by dint of evolution. It's like, because of the way we have evolved to, for example, love our significant other. We have evolved to have friends, and he kind of distills the what is it, like 8 or so that are bedrock foundations of humankind
and heritable characteristics across the spectrum of humanity, which is something that sociologists and anthropologists sometimes don't love to consider.
And it's something that we really stress tested with him, because this idea of trying to find universals is just kind of an unpopular thing to do in 2021. Why you got a lump instead of split? Yeah,
and actually, I don't want to drag this opening any longer because this is one of our longer conversations already, but I should pin a note that in reading Christakis, which I recommend to everyone, I really related to this desire to find universals. But in one of my fields of study, which is linguistics, I was actually trained in the school of rabid splitters, hated lumpers. If you've listened to our talk with Adam Neely, I went on a bit of a tangent about my relationship to Noam Chomsky's scholarship in linguistics. So it's funny finding myself on the other camp. One technical point to note before we actually start, we had a bit of a side tangent within a tangent conversation.
Oh, yes.
About Christakis's idea of the exophenotype, which is his version of the idea that Richard Dawkins proposes of the extended phenotype. It's a little topic in evolutionary biology that fascinates me and about which I understand very little. So it would have been irresponsible for me to not exploit the chance of having him on a Zoom call to ask him about it. But it really came out of nowhere at the end. So rather than trying to artificially insert it into the edit, I'm just going to leave it in the post-credits. There's a bonus for anybody who wants to listen. I usually use it to drop some outtakes and Easter eggs. This time you're going to get a 12-minute worth of Easter egg. If we were more responsible and mercenary, we would have probably put it behind a paywall in our Patreon or something, but we are not yet that. But if you do want to support our Patreon, it exists on certain things, and soon so will our Substack support system if you want to show pecuniary love. But if you want to show non-pecuniary love, you can also just share us with friends, because that's actually the best way to show love to us and to your friends. And give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, because that really helps us.
And if you're a listener that makes it all the way to the end of the extended phenotypes, you should definitely let us know. Send us a tweet. Send us your hashtag exophenotype tweets.
And with that,
Nicholas Christakis.
I see you guys are all distributed at home too. I mean, it's interesting because I come across to many people as very extroverted, and I don't mind being in a group, although I don't particularly like groups. I can be sociable. I can engage with groups of people, etc. But actually, I'm maybe not so secretly just deeply introverted. Like the only thing I want to do is sit in my office and write, or think, or look at statistical output. And so the pandemic has been a godsend.
Oh,
because I just
you're in your element.
Yes. It's, and I'm not going to say I'm going to miss the pandemic when it's over, and it's not over yet. But certainly there have been some unexpected benefits. Let's just say that.
For sure.
Is that? I'm sure there's also like a large correlation with being a career academic and being an introvert, isn't there? Or there has to be in order to actually do the work.
Yes and no. I mean, certainly the stereotype, and my impression is that academics are kind of antisocial nerds. They get very obsessed with small things. They're socially awkward, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, I think certainly in many cases that's true. I mean, I think academics are less socially gifted than politicians, or than. But it also reminds me a little bit of those movie stars that you read their profiles occasionally, and they hate it. They find it really stressful to like constantly be on display and and out there. And I'm thinking, well, why the hell did you become a movie star? I mean, how it's incompatible with your profession. I mean, it's like. So.
And it's true, because you also see a lot of those people who, when they're on stage, they can explode, and then you meet them in person, and they are those nebulous creatures.
Well, to be fair, the vast majority of actors are not movie stars. So the vast majority are probably just living for the art, not recognized. It's only this very small echelon.
Well, a part of that as well is that if you're right, Vanessa's right. We should draw a distinction between celebrities who can be recognized on the street and just working actors. But even for the celebrities, part of it is they get annoyed, be constantly recognized. After a while, it's like, Jesus, I just like to go to the grocery store and not have to. I once remember I went to I had some testimony in the United States in a committee of the United States Senate a long time ago. I was 40 or something, and I went to the Capitol, and I walked into the building, and then I went to the hearing room, and then all of a sudden there was like Bob Dole and like Ron Wyden and all these United States senators who, of course, I had seen on the news since I was a young person. It felt like I knew who they were, and I felt like I knew their character, and of course they had no idea who I was.
Right.
Like I wanted to go and say, "Hi, Bob, how are you?" And I mean, it must be both flattering to people like that, but also irritating, right? Like, I don't know who you are. How dare you, address me like we're old friends?
Yeah, and this is something that messes up with your ability to read and react to social situations, right? This goes against our fundamental codes. When you see somebody in the street and their face is just lighting up at seeing you, and you have zero connection to them, it must fuck you up.
Yes.
I have this on a very, very teeny, minuscule level. I do not want to compare myself to a celebrity in any way, shape, or form. But I make a podcast for my company, and so I meet people at my company who have never met me, but who know me because they've listened to every episode. And so we often will begin a conversation like, "Oh, I know you. You're Vanessa."
Yes, exactly.
And it's fine. It doesn't ruin it. It's actually kind of nice. It kind of like brings a level of energy to the meeting, which is kind of fun for me anyway.
Somewhat disorienting. It's clearly something that we're still figuring out how to handle.
Yeah, and I think now that you think about it, I think these types of social interactions, I'm sure scholars have written about this. I'm just not familiar with this. There's a kind of possibility of asymmetric social interaction that is abetted by modern technology, right? Like media that allow us to allow a situation in which one person is known by so very many,
right?
And where those so many very many people feel they have an intimate relationship with that person, and that is so asymmetric. Of course, there were kings in ancient days, although even in ancient days they would have to. You might not recognize the king, right? This is why the king traveled with certain insignia to say this is the king, right? There were no photographs or other media to say, so you'd say, oh my God, this is so and so, and whereas now.
Oh, I recognize him from the back of the coin.
Yes. But even that, is not such an accurate rendition.
Right.
So
not quite.
Not quite. So, but it's interesting because so it's both. There's this sort of asymmetric kind of social relationship that's possible. It reminds me a little bit of like soap operas. Like where the people watching the soap opera really come to be invested in what's happening in the soap opera and really feel like these people are, they know they're fictional, but they really somehow get tricked. It's a bit like, I think that's why media like Instagram, these technologies are built to exploit ancient proclivities. We evolved to be deeply interested in the lives of other people. And we evolved to be very attentive to gossip. And I think soap operas and Instagram are, and so on, and other forms of media actually exploit these ancient proclivities. They give little dopamine hits when we are, peering into the lives of others or learning information about the lives of others that, might potentially have survival utility later on. But it's all a fiction. It's like, it's not real, Anyway.
But that hence more compelling. The fiction is what exactly makes you keep going. Because if it were real, then you'd probably drop off.
It's like in Christopher Nolan's The Prestige, there is this theme that a magic act can be too convincing or it will scare people off.
Maybe, I don't know. Look, yes, perhaps in the case of the soap operas, but if you think about some of these social media technologies, they're a kind of hybrid state. That when you log on to one of these social media and you see typically the best lives of many other people, it's real but fake. It's both. And part of it is, I've talked to some young people about this. If you're connected to 1,000 other people, every single day there's at least one person who is having a vastly better day than you, who's won a prize, who's in scuba diving in the Maldives, who's God knows what they're doing. But everything. So if you're comparing your current day with the best day of 1 out of 1,000 people every single day, you will always be miserable, right? Your every day will always be a lousy day compared to the best day of 1 out of 1,000 people. Every single day.
And that's without even bringing to consideration the fact that these systems incentivize you professionally to curate the best days daily, even while you're miserable. You need to show yourself gallivanting.
And to lie. Even leaving
exactly.
Also.
Exactly. No, that's what I mean. Exactly.
100%.
You're talk about acting. You're creating a whole show of pleasure, joy, opulence, and thriving that is just as not commensurate with your mental or for sometimes your financial state at all.
Yes. This is one of the things I talk about, and maybe you'll use part of this conversation in your podcast. I don't know. We're having a meandering conversation, but
our podcast is meant for meandering conversations. Yes.
No. So one of the things that I contrast. You're probably both surely aware. There's some scientific debate about exactly how to measure economic inequality and how these measures might change across time and may or may not capture the actual reality of the situation. But for the sake of argument, the formal measured economic inequality in our society right now is at like 100-year high. We're like at the age of the robber barons, So it's any argue, and I believe this, it's an unsustainably high level of economic inequality. And the pandemic, of course, struck. Well, we already had this baseline dynamic that as a society we were going to have to address. But one of the differences, socially speaking, in my view, between the level of economic inequality we have now, like the Gini coefficient is like, I don't know what it is, 0.4 or something. it's really high and almost as high as it was, higher than it was in, during the Roaring '20s. One of the differences was that those guys, the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Rockefellers, those people were so wealthy, they laid private railroad tracks, like the private jets of 100 years ago, across multiple states. They would have like a rail line laid for their own personal use. And then they would have specialized rail cars that would transport them, for example. Or I read the story of one very wealthy woman in New York in the 1910s, had air conditioning in her house. Before anyone else, she contrived to have a private rail car that delivered coal underground to her basement and combusted the coal to drive compressors, which cooled the air in her Manhattan townhouse. I mean, the level of opulence required for these things and wealth was just extraordinary. So there were people who lived like that, of course, let alone all the other fancy stuff. But my point is, we didn't know about it. Those people lived behind hedges, and the media were owned by them or didn't report on them. So right now, on the other hand, the inequality is more manifest. The person on the street is aware of how much wealthier people live, what the lifestyles of the rich and famous. What is the lifestyle of these individuals? We have drones that can fly over their properties. We have photography. We have public record keeping that reports. We have the Forbes 100 list that replies us. We have
reality television shows that go in
yes,
their homes.
All of these things, exactly. So, I think this cannot but increase resentment.
But something changed, because in the 80s to 90s, the media was still obsessed with opulence. It put it right in front of you.
I name checked Robin Leach the other day, and there was blank stares around me. Apparently, Robin Leach is not sticking with the younger generation. But Robin Leach, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Do you remember that, Adam?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, also blank stare. It was like MTV Cribs before MTV Cribs. It was a British guy.
Well, and it exactly serves my point. The thing is that people really want to see that, and there seems to be a lot of people took pleasure in this fantasy and like partly entertaining the possibility of maybe reaching there themselves. Something changes now that this is creating more resentment than it does a sense of pleasure or potential or a dream, even though the material conditions of most people haven't declined in proportion to how much resentment has accrued, I think. Something changed. No?
It's got to be, and I want to hear what Nicholas has to say about this, but I think it's got to be something about American culture too, right? Because I'm thinking when my dad's Irish, he used to say the difference between America and the U.S. is that you look at someone with a lot of money and you say, "Ooh, I want to be them," and in Ireland you say, "Oh, you look at someone with a lot of money and you want to how do we tear them down?" And I think that seems to be shifting in the U.S. Doesn't seem to be as integral to our culture anymore.
All of these observations, I think, have some truth and validity to them. I don't know. I can't rightly say exactly to what extent each of them applies, but I do agree. First of all, I don't think just to pick up one thread from what each of you said. What Adam said, one of the reasons Americans have historically been so willing and able to tolerate this level of inequality has been the belief, if not the partial reality, of class mobility. So the reason the poor are willing to tolerate the rich is because they believe that one day I might be rich too. So I don't want, and there is the possibility of class mobility in our society declining in the last few years, but historically has always been that far exceeds what other societies allow. So you have all these billionaires, many of them, started life with quite humble means, for example. And those are stories in the media that people can understand and relate to.
So wait, so are you thinking that we lost our potential for mobility?
No, it's not that we've lost our potential for mobility, although there is some decline. I've seen some evidence for this. It's that I'm not sure you're right that this is a very complicated area. So on the one hand, the median American household has not incomes have not risen after accounting for inflation for the median American household in like 20 or 30 years. So people, all the rise in wealth in society have primarily gone to the top 1% of the society. And that's partly a reflection of what we were talking about earlier about the economic inequality. So, and I think that is one of the things that's also manifesting itself in our politics. There's this kind of disgruntlement, like, for example, a kind of upper working class wage, from 30 years ago was enough to support your family. Now it's not. You need two jobs or both people need to work and so on. Same actually with middle class households. They feel further and further falling behind. People, we pay our congressman, I forgot what we pay him, a couple $100,000 or I don't know what it is right now, but it's really not the median income for a household of four in our country is still like 60 grand or something like that. Mm-hmm. So we pay our congressman 2 or 3 times that, which probably seems a lot to their constituents, but actually it's not a lot of money in general for an important job, let alone for many of those people who could have earned money, doing other things. So the median household income hasn't really gone up by many measures. On the other hand, by other measures, it has, because these economic accounts do not, for example, take into account the existence of an iPhone or a telephone. In other words,
lowering costs.
Yes. So the quality of life, you see, has gone up. Of course, like a person at the median today is living a better life than the person at the median 30 years ago, by many accounts. So these are complicated topics.
Yeah,
but I think no one would argue, I don't think, that. Well, actually, some people do argue that they say that after you account for government transfers, income inequality has not gone up, which is another complicated and somewhat odd claim.
Right.
But most people would agree that we have higher levels of inequality than we used to have.
Right. I'll just throw it in, and then we'll jump to your first book that we're going to discuss.
I have a segue in mind, Dom. Just FYI.
The question is always like, to what extent inequality is a useful parameter in itself, barring for just the social impact of resentment, because if the rising quality level, or if the life quality balances out in a way that a majority of people feel secure generally, and then the inequality in itself doesn't really matter aside for the invidiousness it engenders, does it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I've understood your question, that's the classic comparison on absolute versus relative standing. Mm-hmm. So, and this can be illustrated by anecdotes such as the following. Would you rather be a poor person in the United States is economically maybe vastly better off than a rich person in many very poor countries, or a rich person, let's say, in a little village in Latin America,
or even a rich American 40, 50 years ago?
Yes, or the famous example is, you and I are leading lives that far surpass the luxury of Julius Caesar. We can heat our water with the touch of a button. We have rapid communications with anyone we want in the world. We have all the information we want. We have a level of security that doesn't require Praetorian Guard. We have all of these.
Even more recently, we far surpass the lives of British lords during the height of colonial Britain.
Yes, exactly. So that's like, so absolutely speaking, we are better off than those people. But relatively speaking,
psychologically speaking, that's the virus there.
I might still rather prefer to be Julius Caesar than to be Nicholas Christakis, on the other hand, anyway.
Yeah. Odessa, take us to Blueprint.
I'll attempt to, but then I'll hand it over to you, Dom. But one of the themes that I think is going to come up across a lot in this conversation, which is one we're already talking about, is the perception of division instead of the search for commonality. And I think we're already talking about this, like people are dwelling in the inequities, the differences. And so I think this is like a theme that comes up in a lot of your books. And I think we can definitely dive into Blueprint, because I think Dom and I are very curious about this project that you took on to try and find these universalities at a time when people are not terribly interested in universalities, or it feels like an old-fashioned kind of thing to do in a way.
We'll try to wade our way, and if you need to call us idiots for our questions, please do. So this goal of finding universals in human behavior, something that has been considered anathema by many scholars in philosophy and the social sciences. We were more interested in seeing the concrete differences and sometimes the irreducible differences of groups rather than studying the underlying commonalities. So what drove you in the opposite direction?
Well, first of all, there's a ton to say in response to that. I mean, at least I'm going to forget probably some of these points, but at least several ideas come to mind. First of all, for too long, in my view, scientists and people on the street have been focused on the terrible aspects of our evolutionary heritage, on our impulses for selfishness or prejudice or hatred or cruelty or violence. And and these defects in human beings and in human societies are obvious. I mean, every century is replete with horrors, right? We have pogroms and the Inquisition and slavery and warfare and torture and fascism and misinformation, and it just goes on and on and on. All the awful things that we humans have done to each other forever. It's true, but equally, it's true that we are capable of tremendous goodness. We are capable of love and friendship and cooperation and teaching and all these other wonderful qualities that we actually evolved to manifest. And so part of me was very concerned that we did not have an adequate attention to or account of these wonderful qualities. And I would even argue that these wonderful qualities are a better reflection of our true nature. Look, if every time I came near you, you lied to me, you filled me with falsity about the world around me, or you were cruel to me, or you took my stuff, or you killed me, I would be better off living apart from you, right? I would be better off living alone. But that's not how we live. We do not live alone. We live socially. And so the benefits of a connected life must necessarily have outweighed the costs. And so what are those benefits? How can we attend to those benefits? And that's in part of what the project Blueprint was all about, was to outline the benefits of social life and provide an evolutionary account for their origin: love, friendship, cooperation, teaching, and so on. First point. Second point, there's this, related to this, is this desire not only to highlight divisions between groups, but also to use evolutionary biology and genetics to highlight the differences between groups. And this also goes back a long time. But that's not what's interesting to me. I'm not interested in using exploring genetic differences between groups. I'm interested in understanding the genetic similarity between groups. Virtually all human beings are, 99.6% identical genetically. And this can provide an account for a variety of universal qualities, like these qualities that I've just mentioned, that natural selection has endowed us with. And I think this is also familiar to any person that's traveled. You go to another part of the world, and maybe initially you're struck by how different things are here. The odors are, the food smells different, the people smell different, the religion is different, the language is different, how they go about their work is different, the fabrics are different. Let me photograph this, this thing or that thing. It's all so different. But if you spend some time in that part of the world and talk to people, you very quickly usually realize how similar they are. They tell jokes. They enjoy the company of their family. They have schools for their children. They work together and to organize themselves. They engage in all kinds of wonderful phenomena that make social life possible. And you can then, and it's recognizing that sameness, you see, that is so interesting to me. And so that's another aspect to your question, which is ways in which these ideas, for example, about evolutionary and biology and genetics, need not be seen as threatening to any kind of, people always say, oh, what about eugenics? Well, no, that's not what I'm talking about. It's got nothing to do with that, right? We're talking about something else. Second point. Third point, actually two more points. Related to the third point is that there is right now a moment in the United States in particular, and perhaps around the world, where there's a lot of political hay to be made from highlighting differences between groups. The rural versus the urban, the rich versus the poor, black versus white, immigrant versus non-immigrant, generational differences, boomers versus Gen Z, and all of these differences. But I, quite apart from the fact that I think that's politically ill-advised and dangerous, and quite apart from the fact that I think that it is, it's philosophically not in keeping with the kind of society I want to live in. I don't want to live in a society that emphasizes the differences between people. I also think it is not an accurate reflection of who we are. That we are all human beings. We're all soft on the outside. We have a kind of common humanity that both science and philosophy reify and or should reify. And that is, part of what I try to do in Blueprint. So you're right, Adam, to say that the book tries to act as a bit of a gentle corrective to this ascendant emphasis on difference, which I think is wrong scientifically and ill-advised politically and bankrupt philosophically, in my view. So I think that so that's like, I think, the third point I would make in that regard. And actually, I'll make a sub-point to that, and then I'll make the fourth point, and then I'll shut up. The side point to that is, if you think about the current political moment in our society, and you think about this emphasis on difference, all these divisions among us, and all these actors who are highlighting, both on the left and on the right, who are highlighting divisions in our society for their own political power, I would say. There are two ways out of that. One way out of that, so we imagine you have a population of 1,000 people, and it's been divided into groups, and these groups are at each other's throats. One way out of that is to go up a level, right? And to say, well, we're all Americans. And so all these divisions you see are less important if we're all members of the same group. And we evolved to have actually this capacity to do such a thing. For example, when I did review in the book some famous examples of groups that are in conflict, and then when they have a common enemy, suddenly they unite. And I mean, this is the trope in science fiction movies. Human beings are fighting with each other, then the aliens invade, and then we all come together to fight the aliens. And so one solution to intergroup conflict is to go up a level, to recognize what we all have in common. And part of, and to some extent, some believe, and I think there's some truth to this, that part of the reason we're having so many divisions and problems in the United States right now, why we're at each other's throats, is an aftershock of the demise of the Soviet Union. That we used to have a common enemy in the Russians. And now with the fall of the Soviet Union, we don't. And so it's easier to fight among ourselves when we're not facing, let's say, some shared enemy. To be very clear, I have nothing against the Russians. I love Russian literature and Russian society. I don't like some aspects of Russian politics, and I certainly don't like what the Russians have been doing in our society lately, but interfering in our elections and everything else. But anyway, the point was, so one solution to group level conflict is to go up a level. But and this was sort of captured by Alexander de Tocqueville's description, that anyone can be an American. We're all Americans, that you just have to buy into a certain set of the Bill of Rights. You accept the Bill of Rights, anyone can be an American. And we're a nation of immigrants. We have all these wonderful qualities in our society whose purpose is to take an axe to these types of divisions, to reduce tribalism, to bond us together, pluribus unum, and so on. So we have
buy into the rule book and you can play the game.
Yes, go up a level. But there's another solution to tribalism and this intergroup conflict, and that's to go down a level. And I discussed that a little bit in Blueprint, because one of the ironies about living socially as we do, and as other mammals do, one of the ironies is that we also had to evolve the capacity to be distinctive individuals. In other words, to live socially, we must be individuals. Why? Well, we in our species, we communicate our individuality with our faces. I don't know if you've ever given any thought to this. Why do all of our faces look different? All our kidneys work the same. For your kidney to do its job and my kidney to do its job, it has to work the same. But for my face to do its job, it has to be different than your face. Each of our faces look different. And this is an evolutionary luxury, that we evolved the capacity to signal our identity using our faces, and that they're all different. There's a lot of genetic machinery that is required to make our faces look different. And furthermore, there's a lot of genetic machinery that is required to give us brains that are capable of distinguishing faces. You can look at a sea of faces and you can see, these 1,000 people, every one of them is different, to recognize that difference. Now, the reason we evolved to have these capacities to signal and detect individual identity is in the service of living socially. If you don't want to forget who you've had sex with, or who you owe a favor to, or who your child is, that you want to care for this child and not someone else's child. You need a way to signal and detect, hi, I am your offspring, care for me. So the capacity for individual identity is, evolved with the capacity to live socially. So we have this capacity to be distinctive individuals, to revere distinctive individuals. Incidentally, this is also connected to grief. Why do we grieve when people die? Grief is not sadness, it's not depression. Grief is a very distinctive emotion, which I used to be a hospice doctor. I took care of people who were dying. So I frequently was exposed to and thought about grief. And also in my personal life, I've had grief. Very distinctive emotion. One of the reasons grief is so distinctive is that it's connected to the death of a particular person, right? You don't grieve when people you don't know die. You grieve when some specific person that you know died. You might be sad at the deaths of unknown people, but it's not grief, okay? So we have all this capacity for individual identity. And this is also a way out of tribalism. In other words, instead of going up a level to we're all Americans, you can go down a level to we're all individuals. And this is part of our political history too. If you think about Martin Luther King, what King argues, because he looks forward to living in a time when people are judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, can be seen as individuals. So the way to address your question about our current predicament of this tribalism in the United States right now, in my view, evolutionary biology, our evolution has endowed us with tools to escape this problem, to go up a level or to go down a level. That's my...
But it seems to me, when these are the two options, that tension, and this is a side point, but where I guess we're immersing ourselves in side points, the current tension in the U.S. is, at least in some part, driven by the question whether we go up or down a level.
No, but I don't see those as, we can do both. You see, this is the thing. What we don't want to do is stay in the middle. That's what we want to avoid. We can all be a part of the American project and also recognize our individuality. I don't think that's the tension. I think the tension right now is at that middle level where a lot of people get a lot of benefit from privileging tribalism. There are lots of people who see it as in their interest to emphasize difference.
Yeah, I guess if you go all the way up to the idea that all humanity is some shared unit of shared community, then it kind of goes full circle back to individualism, because total universality just means collection of individuals. Part of the criticism from the new nationalists against America's history of hyper-individualism. You've imagined a universal group that admits no difference between different nations, between American and Chinese and Middle Eastern and European and whatever. And basically the conservative argument is that you should have commitments to your neighbors that are different than the rest of the world. And by reducing everything to an individual level or to an overly universalized group, which effectively is the same thing, you're missing the core connections that allow for purpose and meaning to emerge. And I guess the counter argument, or I'd say the mirror argument of this on the left, is that when you bring everything up to a universality, when humanity is just one big happy family, you are effectively burying insidious cultural differences and disparities and inequalities.
Yeah, so there's truth to both of those critiques, of course. But first of all, I would say we've overcorrected and we've lost the understanding and vision of our common humanity. On the right-wing critique, there's absolutely good criticism of that, in the sense that what totalitarian regimes try to do is to eliminate and reduce the connection people feel to the direct social intimates. You're supposed to owe your allegiance to the state or to dear leader, right? And so this is why, in communist China or North Korea, everyone dresses the same. And we're supposed to address each other as comrade. We're all the same. Or the Stasi in East Germany try to eliminate friendship because we don't want you don't want to have intimate friends that you really trust. You're supposed to only trust the state and distrust your friendships. Or even in the kibbutzes, for example, why we might have collective child rearing, so that we want to break the family unit so that you don't feel a special loyalty to the family. It's all discussed in Blueprint. So you're absolutely right that and that's not what I'm advocating from. By saying going up a level, I don't say we should all be like what's it called? That the dystopian novel. Okay, there's so many dystopian novels.
Brave New World,
1984.
Harrison Bergeron.
Yeah, all of them, and Handmaid's Tale. I was looking for Handmaid's Tale. I'm not suggesting that we should all become like that. I'm just saying that part of our identity, the way out politically for our tribalism, is to see ourselves as part of the American project, or as we're all Americans. So that's that. And on the far left, this notion that, you're just effacing difference in power relations. Look, I'm not effacing difference in power relations. Of course, I understand they're important, but I'm saying an overemphasis on that thins out our shared understanding of each other, gives us a kind of bankrupt view of human beings, one that I think is inexorably negative. That says that we always are at each other's throats. I don't agree with that. I fundamentally reject that notion. I reject the notion that because you look different than me, I cannot understand you, or I can't have common cause with you. That's ridiculous. First of all, I reject that scientifically. I also reject it philosophically and morally, and I certainly reject it politically. That this notion that our superficial differences are the most important thing about us is wrong. And there are these wonderful videos that went viral a few years ago. I mean, unfortunately, they were for like beer ads or something, for some kind of beer in Europe, where they had people that looked superficially very different, black and white and rich and poor. They were like working class guys with tattoos and people in suits, and they all came in and they're different, gay and straight, in a very stereotypic way. They looked very gay, and they brought all these people into this room, and they were all looking at each other suspiciously. These cameras, this panopticon cameras, like all these people, and then they said, who was a class clown? And the groups divided, totally ignoring everything else. You had class clowns in every part of the group, or who was bullied in school, and divided. Who came from a divorced household? Who's lost someone they loved? And then you found this like tattooed, pierced person sitting next to this like prim suit person who were hugging each other because they understood each other's sadness and what it meant to lose a parent when you're a child, right? It brings you to tears to see this, right? And it's this is what I think the way we should see each other, at least in my view. And although the Blueprint was not a work of politics, and it's just a little bit of work of philosophy, it's primarily a work of science. It's in the service of that vision of our common humanity. There was a little thread we left, if I might, like the fourth point of the 4 points, your original question, which had to do with scientifically, what does it mean to look for specifics versus universals? And this is also an old issue in the sciences. And I think Charles Darwin first talked about lumpers and splitters. So for example, the 19th century project to understand the natural world, some people were trying to find more and more examples of different species or animals. They were the splitters. And other people were trying to find systematic similarities between different, why are these animals all like this? What's explaining that? They're the lumpers, right? And the same holds true with many other branches of science, whether it's histology or astronomy, or chemistry. Why are the noble gases all similar? We're not just going to find another noble gas and another noble gas and another gas. There's something similar about the noble gases. They're a lumper. Well, they all have filled electron shells and they're very inert and so forth. Or sodium and potassium. Why are they similar and not dissimilar, and so on? So this issue of lumpers versus splitters also applies in the social sciences. For example, in anthropology, there was people who were interested, during the 19th century, the anthropologists fanned out around the world to say, look at all this great human variety. Look at all these different societies. Let's richly ethnographically describe each of these societies. It's so interesting and rich and different. These people are different than those people are different than those people. And let's really understand each one as distinct. Okay, that is fascinating and important. But there was another strand which said, no, look, all of these societies have sports. All of these societies have deities. All of these societies have adornment, personal adornment, and so on and so forth. These are the lumpers. Say, well, these are the similarities. So there was a tradition of looking at universality in the social sciences as well for the last couple of hundred years, and so that's a kind of methodologic aspect to the question you asked. I actually have one other thing that I just wanted to mention, if I could, and then I'll shut up.
And by the way, you actually took us to our next question.
Yes.
But go on.
Go.
Well, I was just going to say, Blueprint aspires to be on the shelf, right next to Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Steven Pinker's, sort of better angels of our nature in a way, because you could make the argument, and Steve does make this argument, that it is because of the Enlightenment, because of Enlightenment philosophers, because of the philosophical and scientific advances of the Enlightenment, that human beings are so better off today. That the philosophical principles of human equality and democracy, now, even though these were imperfectly applied and took a while to spread out and be applied to all groups equally, I understand those critiques. But nevertheless, one of the reasons slavery was finally eliminated from the planet, and incidentally, it's not fully eliminated. There are 40 million people that are slaves today. There are more slaves today than there were during the American Civil War around the world. And there are countries in the world, including in Africa, with chattel slavery, where if you're born, you can be born a slave. You're the property of other people. So there are tens of millions of people that live in various forms of slavery, not just sexual trafficking, but other kinds of slavery in the world today. And it doesn't get as much attention as it should. But nevertheless, this institution of slavery, which had been around for thousands of years in human history, the Vikings had slaves, the Romans had slaves, Americans had slaves, this goes on, was finally brought to heel because, I believe, and it's been shown, because of Enlightenment philosophical principles that start in Europe and spread around the world. And that's coupled with scientific advances in chemistry and physics, for example, the steam engine and so on, that make our material circumstances so much better, so that now, 200 or 300 years later, the world is more peaceful and people live longer. We live in a better world, Stephen argues, as a product of the Enlightenment. And that's true. But what I'm trying to do is trying to say the following. We don't just need to look to recent history to get an account of a good life in the last 200 or 300 years. Deeper, more ancient, more powerful forces are at work propelling a good society, providing a predicate for and a model for how to live a good life, providing us and equipping us for love and friendship and cooperation and teaching and all these wonderful qualities. And that those forces go back hundreds of thousands of years, and they are evolutionary forces.
They're encoded in us.
Yes. And the argument that I make is that the arc of our evolution is long, but it bends towards goodness. And that is what I'm attempting to do in Blueprint.
Because I got to say that actually, I marked here to get into the methodological side of it, and I do want to open it because I think it's really interesting how you go about finding, or basically, how do you make this argument?
But it also reminded me of a recent XKCD comic strip that I love,
which is the difference between lumpers and splitters. It has the lumper saying, "Well, we're just two people looking for taxonomies, aren't we?" And the splitter says, "Oh, that's exactly what a lumper would say."
Yes.
So
hold on, I want to find the cartoon. 1 second. He says, "Really, we're both just categorization pedants, lumper? Ah, so you're a meta lumper."
So as part of the search to find the bedrock of social interactions, you propose the social suite, which is a list of distinct features of the human capacity to develop connections or distinct types of connections. So do you mind going over these and also explain why you saw them as discrete types of connection and why they're so fundamental rather than, situational contingencies? That sigh.
That's, now you want me to be a splitter and and list all of these individual attributes. All right, hold on. Let me just compose my thoughts here. And let me make the argument. So what you're asking me to do is to summarize one of the key sets of ideas that I try to advance. And what I try to advance is that, what I'm trying in essence to argue is that the genes don't just shape the structure and function of our bodies, our anatomy and our physiology. Genes also don't just shape the structure and function of our minds, our behaviors, for example, but the genes shape the structure and function of our societies. That there's a way in which our evolution has shaped us to live in a particular way. Now, I make a whole bunch of arguments as to how we know this and why this is true. For example, I show that other social mammals, like whales and elephants, with whom we share our last common ancestor was 80 to 90 million years ago with those species, and that animal did not live socially. Elephants have friendship like we do, incidentally, and they make social networks like we do. And they evolved this by independent convergent evolution. Why? Why do the elephants make social networks like this mathematical structure similar to ours? Many animals have sex with each other. We do too. We mate with each other. But we do something else that's extremely rare in the animal kingdom, is that we form long-term, non-reproductive unions with other members of our species. Namely, we have friends. I don't know if you've ever asked yourself, why do we have friends? Why do human beings have friends? Other animals don't do this weird thing. We do it. Certain other primates do it. Elephants do it. Certain cetacean species do it. It's amazing. We evolved the capacity for friendship. So natural selection, you see, has shaped not just the structure and function of our bodies, not just the structure and function of our minds, but also the structure and function of our societies. And the argument is that there are these core features that natural selection has shaped that allow us to live socially. And these features I call the social suite, and there are 8 of them. The first is which we touched on earlier, the first is the capacity to have and recognize individual identity. That in order to live socially, ironically, we have to be able to be unique individuals. The second is the fact that we love our partners and our offspring. We feel we're not the only animals that do this, but we do. We feel a sentimental attachment to individuals we have sex with. Well, why? Why don't we just, have sex? We feel attached to our partners. And incidentally, there's fascinating speculation as to the difference in origin of male versus female attachment, which we can talk about. I mean, the speculation is sort of interesting scientifically. It's difficult to prove, but there's some interesting ideas about that.
Can you give it in first a brief version of that?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Well, the idea is that in the case of women, the love that women eventually, like in our primate past, we might have just mated and then separated, and fathers made very little contribution to the survival of their offspring. But at some point, it became advantageous for females to be able to keep the males involved in the raising of their offspring. But for this, everyone needed to be able to recognize each other. The female needed to be able to track who the male was that was the father of her offspring. Now, the first thing to evolve, the argument goes, was the recognition of your own offspring. In other words, a female clearly would want to breastfeed her own offspring and not someone else's offspring. Although, there's wrinkles on wrinkles in all of this. But anyway, let me just stay on this thread. And so the recognition of offspring is very common in the mammals. Rats also recognize their offspring. They do it, by the way, by recognizing the location of their offspring. Mobile animals like sheep recognize them by smell. So when a sheep is born, it immediately starts walking in a big herd. How does a mother recognize the baby and the baby recognize the mother? So the mother only feeds her own, kid, not someone else's kid. And the kid can nurse from its own mother, not from someone else's mother. So mothers evolved the capacity to recognize their offspring and the offspring of their mothers, which is basically a sentimental attachment between the mother and the offspring. And the argument is that probably what happened at some time in the evolutionary past is this special feeling that the mothers had for their offspring eventually became to apply to their male partners. We can talk about homosexuality too if you want, which is another very interesting topic. But right now we're talking about reproductive unions in the biological ancestral past. So basically, the idea is that the argument is that the love that females feel for males in our species, with whom they're reproducing, is just an extension of the love they used to feel for their babies. And so, in some way, it's yes, exactly. See, Vanessa, exactly. It's like, on the one hand, yuck.
For those who didn't see, I made a face.
Yes, on the one hand, exactly. On the one hand, yuck, and on the other hand, also, actually, the guys often are kind of babies. I can see that. Okay. Now, the story for males is a little bit more confusing. Why and how would the males evolve this capacity to feel a sentimental attachment to the females? These are attempts to reconstruct these things, right? It's difficult to prove this, but there's evidence of different kinds that I review in the book. And here the idea is that initially what happened is that the males evolved capacity in our ancestral past, the primates long millions of years ago, to recognize territory and mark territory. So they would compete with other males. This is my territory. This is your territory. And the parts of the brain, so in other words, there's some MRI studies that have been done when women are asked to think about their sexual partners or their babies, like a similar part of the brain will light up, as if they're thinking about their partners as babies. And for males, similar when they're asked to think about their female partners, parts of their brain related to territoriality light up. It's like, first, they evolved the capacity to recognize and form an attachment to this piece of land, and then they use that apparatus that had evolved, just like feathers. It's called an exaptation. When we evolve one feature like feathers, initially it's felt for insulation, and then we use that feature for a completely new purpose, like flight, right? So there are many famous examples in evolutionary biology of this topic. So the idea is that these psychological features of love are exaptations of other prior qualities, like recognizing offspring or recognizing territory and feeling attached to offspring or territory, and that this might even have been gendered in the way that we're discussing, which raises all kinds of, from unsettling, let's just say, good questions,
Right. So, but then the preferential provisioning that this created is cemented it as an evolutionary efficient path.
Well, what happens is it becomes adaptive. So it becomes adaptive, and then we go down this path where we love each other, where we feel a sentimental attachment to people we reproduce with. Incidentally, we don't just love our sexual partners. That's another whole topic. But I'm talking now just narrowly about the fact that we feel this dyadic bond, which is a fundamental social bond and is a key part of social living, that most human beings are partnered or wish to be partnered and go through life partnered. Now, there are many exceptions, and culture plays a huge role in this, and we can talk about it. But fundamentally, if you, for example, look at chimps, look at our nearest neighbor, bonobos. Bonobos, by the way, are very sexually promiscuous. But anyway, if you look at our primate analogs, you find evidence for these types of qualities. So the second part of the social suite is, first is identity, the second is love, the third is friendship, which I mentioned already, which is we don't just mate with each other, we befriend each other, which is very distinctive. Every human society has friendship, so universal, and fascinatingly so. And the fact that you feel, you feel wonderful in the company of your friends, like it's so soothing to you, and you seek out their company and you can count on them. Every human being knows this feeling. People can die from lacking friends, from lacking this feeling of connection. So it is a very physiologic, innate kind of desire and capacity that we have. And this capacity for friendship then gives rise to social networks, which are these higher order structures in which we are embedded. So it's not just about each of us has our own distinct friends, the three of us on this call, for example, but then everyone to whom we're connected also has friends, and every human being in the free exercise of this desire we assemble ourselves into these higher order structures called networks, which networks are like the ant colonies. Like they have their own properties, like a colony of ants. The ants act independently, but they give rise to this ant colony, which is like a superorganism, which has its own properties distinct from the individual properties. So human networks have properties. For example, we could each of us have friendships in a different way, and we could organize ourselves into one architecture of social ties, which architecture is very prone to epidemic disease. Like we could organize ourselves one way such that diseases would spread very easily in our group. Or you take the same people and the same number of connections and organize them in a different way, and now that network germs would not spread easily. Though that's a higher order property of social networks. It's not about the connections each of us has. It's about how we're all organized together that can give this group, this organization, certain features. For example, the capacity to spread germs or information, or the capacity to work together to achieve certain objectives. These are all topics of research in my laboratory. So that's social networks. That's like the fourth thing, which is a higher order thing than friendship alone. Then we have cooperation, our capacity to cooperate. Many animals cooperate. Certain bacterial species cooperate to work together to create to repel invaders, to create slime, for example, that insulates them from outsiders and so on. So it's not just sophisticated animals like us that cooperate, but it's a feature of us. Not every animal cooperates. We do. And it's interesting that we do, and it's highly relevant to our ability to live together. That's another element of the social suite. The next is the preference for one's own group, or so-called in-group bias, and this is depressing, but it's a true aspect, that we prefer the company of people we resemble. We prefer the company of our own group. And we often hold negative views of other groups. Why? This is a universal. Everyone does this. There's no group in our society which is especially dignified or principled or worthy of respect. Every single group is racist, every group, unfortunately, and or ethnocentric, or however you want to think about, or tribal. They think my group is special, and this is a very depressing observation about human beings. But it's also has played its role in our evolution.
Yeah, it's the oxymoron of my group is best because we're not tribal.
No, I'm sorry, but yes, exactly, you are. Then there's another quality of the social suite is something called what I call mild hierarchy, which is we are inexorably a hierarchical animal, but not too hierarchical. We're not fully egalitarian, nor are we too authoritarian or autocratic. We don't want too much inequality or too much hierarchy. We all resent it. And we have evolved to live in groups with mild hierarchy, which, as it turns out, benefits everybody. And I discuss the ways in which that's the case in the book. And finally, we have this miracle of social learning and teaching, that we evolve to be able to learn from each other, and this is the root of human culture and the root of all our wealth and the root of our civilization. That we have the capacity for cumulative culture, which is innate to us. Now, certain other animals have similar things, none quite as sophisticated as humans. This capacity for culture. And the way to understand this is to understand that just like every sexually reproducing animal has sex with each other, almost every animal can learn from contact with its environment. A little fish in the sea can learn that if it swims up to the light, it'll find food there. That's called independent learning, where the organism learns by contact with its environment, reinforcement, and so on. But some animals, many fewer, can learn socially by observing conspecifics. So, for example, you put your hand in the fire and you learn that it burns. That's independent learning. Or I watch you put your hand in the fire and I learn that it burns. And now I've acquired almost as much knowledge about how bad fire is for my hand, but I paid none of the price. I didn't burn my hand, you did. That is incredibly efficient social learning. Or we were going into the woods and you eat red berries and die. And I watch you eat red berries and die. And now I learn, don't eat red berries. That's incredibly efficient. That's social learning, imitation, mimicry, and so on. That's less common, much less common in the animal kingdom, but many animals do that too. But we do something that's extraordinarily rare in the animal kingdom, which is we teach each other things. It's not just that you teach me to build a fire. It's not just that like I passively watch you put your hand in the fire. You tell me, don't put your hand in the fire. You teach me what to do. And this is exceptionally rare in the animal kingdom, this teaching function. We do it, elephants do it, certain cetacean species, certain primates, and certain other weird animals. There's some, which I won't go into right now, but it's exceptionally rare. And this capacity for teaching is actually a kind of altruism. It's a kind of kindness that we show each other. We share our knowledge with each other. And it's this capacity that gives us the ability to have culture and to accumulate knowledge, to distribute knowledge over time and space, such that all three of us alive today are the beneficiaries of knowledge that was invented and shared by people thousands and then hundreds of years ago. You know, when you are born into the world, animals have already been domesticated. You don't have to domesticate pigs and cows and sheep. Calculus has already been invented. You're just taught calculus. You know, the periodic table has already been figured out. You don't have to do that. It was bequeathed to you by our ancestors. The electrons, the everything, the roads have been, the road making technology, the cement making technology, the knowledge of the stars and navigation. All of these things have been worked out and given to us by our ancestors. It's extraordinary. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And it is one of the key things that has made us, the so-called ascendant species on the planet.
Yeah, I also always thought that making bread is probably the most impressive miracle of human evolution. Just think of the billion of steps and time that it took for people to reach that perfect result.
Yes, and to be perfect, everything from the oven making to the leavening to the flour milling to the domestication of the wheat. A huge amount of it.
So I have this might be a bit of an oddball question, but I mean, I remember when you were talking earlier about, for example, in like totalitarian societies where there was an emphasis, like let us degrade the connection between you and others so that you can kind of sublimate supposedly to this higher calling. Is there a connection between, in your estimation, societies that better accommodate for these kind of universal human evolutionarily predetermined qualities, and then by the formation of the society kind of allows for a bit more success, I suppose, because people are more able to practice these practices?
Yes, that's an argument that I make a little bit. It's not the central argument, but exactly right. I think that those political arrangements that work with our evolutionary tendencies are more apt to be successful than those political arrangements that attempt to subvert. Now, you can do it for a while, right? Like you can, for example, I give the example of kibbutzes. I give many examples.
You get into utopias, which is actually something that I did hope to get into. Some of those, like we don't need to go to totalitarian regimes. We can go to just groups that try to create what we tell ourselves is a better version of human interaction and try to eradicate the aspects of our humanity that we're not comfortable with. And you mentioned how buying into the theory that the root cause of male love is effectively possessive, and that explains a lot. For instance, you can understand discrepancy in jealousy patterns, for instance, and you'd understand why planned societies, utopian societies, would try to eradicate this impulse, but ultimately attempts to do so run against the social suite and are doomed to fail.
Yeah, I review. In the book, I review unintentional communities like shipwrecks and intentional communities like communes and utopian movements, and then artificial communities like that we experiment with in the lab and online and so on, and to support some of the arguments. But just to pick up the thread on utopian society, so the love of one's partner and children was often seen as a threat, either because it caused misery, right? Like the fact that there's so much human suffering comes from wanting people, loving people that you can't have, or relationships that break up, and so much sadness comes from this. Or that we lose the ability to work as a large group because we feel special attachment to particular individuals. So as you point out, the attempts have been to create communitarian societies that lack this feature. Now, interestingly, they've gone to one of two extremes. On the one hand, you might have like the Shakers, which prohibits sex, for example, between members of the group, and try to sort of stop people from having intimate, and the Shakers had very intimate friendships, by the way, but they tried to break down.
Can they have sex outside of the group?
No,
there
was no sex, no abstinence. Abstinence. Sex is bad. It just leads to misery, and every human being has had the experience of sex leading to misery. And so, it's very evocative. You can sort of understand why, I guess if I had no desire and didn't have any kind of sexual interactions with anybody, I'd lose something, but I'd also gain a lot. Let's try that. Let's get rid of that. So that's
all the joys of celibacy.
Yes. So that's the one extreme, and the other extreme is the kind of polyamory, which is actually a very dissimilar solution to the similar problem, which says, okay, instead of forming a particular attachment to a particular person, we'll all have sex with everyone else.
And regarding polyamory, you actually say something that in the book, something that I love, which connects to the Ross Dothert argument about decadence, which is we see that in order to sustain a system like polyamory, you actually need a lot more rules and artificial contracting than your average monogamous relationship.
Yes, that's right. To have a successful polyamorous grouping, it requires actually a lot more effort also, because it's unnatural in a way. So, and I'm not saying, by the way, just to be very clear, I'm talking about social arrangements. I'm not talking about individuals, right? So particular people who wish to be polyamorous, they absolutely should have that right. They should practice what they wish. We live in a free society. They can find other individuals who want to do that. I'm not making any moral judgments, nor am I making any political prescriptions. I'm just describing evolutionary capacities that we have. And so this capacity we have, or desire we have, for these types of dyadic relationships, and incidentally, we also love outside of reproduction, or homosexual unions and so on. These capacities that we have some communitarian societies try to stop them by, let's say, the Shakers going to abstinence, or certain of these communes going to polyamory, both of which are trying to address, as I said, the same problem, which is we don't want you to love one particular person, right? That's bad for our group. So we want to stop that. So you can't have sex with anyone, or you must have sex with everyone, either extreme, as it were. So that is so, and so we don't have to look for authoritarian regimes which are trying to regulate, or certain cults, for example, where the leader picks everyone's, mates. We don't have to look for those examples. We can look for more ordinary examples, and there are many communes as well. Like I said, collective child rearing. Plato talks about this. That collective child rearing has been repeatedly tried because it has rightly been identified. The attachment women feel to their offspring, and fathers too, by the way, has been rightly identified as a barrier to the equality between the sexes in idealized utopian societies where many people would rightly want women and men to be treated equally. But there's a fundamental biological difference between men and women, which is that women give birth to children. And that this has been seen as a threat to some of these utopian commitments. And so the solution that has independently been discovered by many people is to say, well, why don't we just provide, creches? We'll provide places where there'll be professional care of the children so that the women and men can be on equal footing. This has never worked. It's always, after a period of time, collapsed. And it's because it's going against our nature. So those political arrangements that go with our nature are more apt to survive. And Stasi, like the Stasi Eastern Germany example, yes, with a lot of effort, you can really suppress humans' desire for friendship, make them really afraid to have friends for fear of being ratted out. But it takes an enormous force to oppose this motion, this desire, and it cannot be sustained indefinitely. Eventually, it collapses.
So a question that I keep asking myself, and I'm going to ask you, when you were coming up with these principles, where and how did you draw the lines? Because, for instance, there's a theme that keeps coming up. In my view, other ideas may be sprouting from it. And that's the human ability to create individuation and separation. And ultimately, inequality circles back to our first point of discussion. It's just inequality is foundational in human experience. And also that's why all the attempts by utopian societies to extinguish this instinct towards inequality and individuation have failed. But if you don't want to go into inequality again, a different example of why I think maybe some of the ideas of the social suite might be a manifestation of a more foundational idea, we can look at the transferring of knowledge. How much is this a discrete concept, or how much is it the result of the authority principle? It's our proclivity to trust certain sources of authority more than others, to put our faith in the tribe's elders or priests or scribes, that is actually at play in our ability to transfer knowledge.
Well, first of all, I was going to joke that you want to be a lumper instead of a splitter on my social suite and group some together. And I
you're too much of a splitter for me.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I agree with that, and we can talk about that. And I try to explain that. But on the authority thing, I do discuss that in terms of teaching. So there are different kinds of hierarchical ways of organizing social animals. And there are sort of status hierarchies in which the dominant animal achieves its dominance because of the penalties that it can impose on its subordinates. So like, I'm bigger than you, so I beat you up, and therefore I'm dominant. And many mammals do this, elephant seals and deer with big antlers and all kinds of creatures. The bigger animal is higher up in the totem pole because they can impose costs on their subordinates. But some animals, us included, have a parallel kind of hierarchy, which is called prestige hierarchy. And here, it's not the cost you can impose on your subordinates. And in status hierarchies, the subordinate animals try to avoid their superordinates, right? Stay away from this top dog because they can punish me. In prestige hierarchies, subordinates seek out their superordinates because of the benefits they can confer. And that is what teaching comes in. In other words, we share information, and this gives us a parallel means of having hierarchy. In other words, someone who knows a lot is someone who's sought out by others. You know how to make a cabinet or repair a car or do statistical analyses. And you have specialized skills that you can transmit and create a benefit for your subordinates. And here your subordinates come close to you. They wish to be near you in order to acquire this and revere you, not because of what harm you can impose on them, but rather what benefits you can offer them. And so this is uncommon in animals. Some species have this type of prestige hierarchy. We have it. And it is a counterpoint. There are different ways of achieving success in our society or having power. And one of them, it comes through not just being stronger, let's say, but also being smarter. And that is a key feature of our species.
In other words, you're saying it works in reverse too. The success of transmission, or a desire for successful transmission of knowledge, can be the cause of hierarchy rather than the other way around. So I see Vanessa is itching to ask you about COVID and your book, Apollo's Arrows. But before getting there, I'll be remiss if I don't mention the infamous YouTube video now that we're like 6 years away, right? And in a stupid way, it seems to be bringing together both our themes of lumpers versus splitters and the trouble of transmitting knowledge. I think it's interesting to dwell on this video, which was almost like a litmus test or a moment where reality shattered into alternative narratives or parallel worlds where never the twain shall meet in how people interpreted what they saw. It was as if half the people watching the video saw young, brave kids fighting for justice, and others saw a decent professor trying to reach out to a mob of petulant children. And this moment basically set in motion the stupid spiral of culture war asininity that we have been entrenched in. We're 6 years, almost to the day, from that event. Do you have any thoughts on that legacy that you have unwittingly participated in?
Well, I can't speak to the larger, many of your listeners won't know, thankfully, will not know what you're talking about. And you would not have been remiss had you not brought it up. It would have been fine for you not to bring it up.
I think it would be remiss. I suspect that some number of our listeners would expect at least.
Oh, I see.
At least some acknowledgement of the incident.
Well, I just happened to, walk into a propeller. I mean, I've been a professor my whole life. I think people can look up my history. They can look up my commitments. They can judge how good or not good I am as a scientist. They can judge how good or bad is my character. They can judge my commitments and my actions over my lifetime. I was a hospice doctor who took care of dying people in the south side of Chicago for many years, primarily minority communities, very poor indigent communities. I took my bag and I went out and I took care of people who were dying at home, often in very demanding circumstances. And I have tried to live a life of meaning and purpose, and one that's also committed to certain core values. These include a vision of our common humanity, and they also include certain commitment to civil society, which includes the principles in the Bill of Rights, like free expression, for example. Now, it's not just a political idea, it's a belief. In fact, you could argue that, like the things we were talking about earlier, like in order to teach and learn from each other, we have to create the widest possible circle of interlocutors who can speak to each other with the freest and most open discourse. Else we will not learn. And so there is some connection between my scientific discoveries and interests and my philosophical beliefs and my political commitments, although they're loose, these interactions. Anyway, what you're alluding to is a situation where I walked into a propeller about 5 or 6 years ago at Yale, and there was attempting to defend the right of students to express themselves as they saw fit, and to have students sorted out among themselves. And this, was racialized in a certain particular way, mostly by others, I would argue, and hit a particular cultural moment, or served as an instant in the larger debate that was taking place in our society. And I almost never discuss it publicly. My wife and I were just, quiet about it. I wrote one piece about it, and just one piece, and I, just don't discuss it. I just will say we did our best in coping with what were very challenging circumstances, where I think the students misjudged us badly and acted tremendously immaturely. We tried to deal with it. And as you're alluding to, it was an event that was part of a broader set of social happenings. And so anyway, thankfully that's far behind me.
Yeah, and I think I should just let you know where I'm coming from on this issue. It's just that as a journalist, and one that deeply values the academic tradition, in my case, coming from studying history, I've been in touch with, I'm talking about 2012, 2011, I've been in touch with a lot of professors in elite American universities who have been talking to me off the record about the constraints that were growing around them, where it came to discussing certain topics or certain limitations in favor of an ever-shifting concept of student sensitivity. I'm talking about literature professors that weren't able to teach certain texts, or history professors that weren't allowed to touch certain historical periods, even ones that they were experts in. And they felt betrayed by their own universities that had failed to protect the core principles of an open exchange of ideas and free inquiry.
No, academia has done a terrible job of defending these principles lately.
Exactly. And the sense that I was getting from the people that I was talking to, that they weren't willing to come forward with any of this because they were scared for their job. But then naively, I thought, it's when I saw your video that this is it. This is such an absurd display that surely it will release the pressure from this subject, and everybody will realize how silly all of this is, and it will start a process of amelioration. And there's going to be a chance to discuss it openly, but as it turned out, I think it actually led to the worst version of narrative splitting, where the right just turned it into the dumbest rallying cry against the woke. That wasn't the verbiage at the time, I think, but it doesn't matter. Well, in the same time, on the left, people took it as an excuse to be even more shrill and obstinate. And now you see writers and thinkers as far up as the New York Times saying that maybe free speech shouldn't be sacrosanct after all.
No, they're insane. Those people are totalitarians, and they're to be resisted, powerfully resisted. People who try to put an axe to the root of free expression in our society. That is the path of totalitarianism, whether from the left or the right, and it must be resisted. I was in the courtyard for about 90 minutes. Video footage from multiple angles has now been released by many people. There's Jamie Kirchick, a journalist, published in in Tablet magazine, I think, published a lot of footage. There are a few things I wish I had done differently, but by and large, I think I kept my cool, and I was trying to dignify the students and take their arguments seriously, and try to treat them as adults and say, here's why I disagree with this, or I agree with that, or whatever. I would seriously doubt that any of the students present would be very proud of their behavior. At least I would hope they wouldn't be proud of their behavior. Now, as to the expedient use by the left and the right of events that day, that's nothing I can do about that.
No, of course. No, I'm just lamenting. It's not if it comes.
No, but you're right. I mean,
you would think that. I thought that you were such a great representative of that pent-up pressure that I was getting a sense of from talking to professors, especially in elite schools at the time, a sense of intellectual suffocation. I was thinking about professors having to completely expunge and Butlerize their curriculums because certain topics in parts of the literary and historic canon were deemed inappropriate or offensive, or just afraid to step into it because they knew that the administration wasn't going to take their side. And again, seeing your video just filled me momentarily and abortively with hope that we're at the pivotal moment and that we're going to shift away from the momentary panic. But it clearly didn't. And maybe it was the election of Trump. Maybe it was the destructive power of social media. And maybe it was just our David Frenchian tendency towards more and more division. But clearly it didn't. It was just the harbinger of worse to come. And I lament it especially because, for what it's worth, from my humble view, you were possibly the best person to be in that situation, to represent this liberal ideal. You were not there to foment culture war drama. You were not there to make yourself the subject of a viral clip. You were actually trying to talk to those students. You were trying to have a real discussion, the sort of dialectic that so many of us took for granted as the soul of the liberal sciences and the soul of the academy, only to be disabused of these quaint ideas by the people you call the authoritarians.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that very much. Like I said, I did my best in what was a very unexpected and challenging moment in my life. And as I said, I'm really happy that I published 2 books since then. And a bunch of science that I've done, and my lab is thriving, and everything is. But I still worry about these topics in our society.
Yeah,
And I am deeply committed to a civil society and to certain liberal principles. I do not reject those principles, and I'm very worried by threats to free expression from the right and the left. I mean, right, let's not forget, there are many state legislatures right now that are seeking to regulate what books can be read. I mean, literally, with these people that learn nothing. They're like banning books. Like, how bad a look is that? You can't read.
And in defense of free speech, often.
No. I mean, sometimes they say that, but it's.
I am sarcastic.
Yes. No, I know it's ridiculous.
Dripping with sarcasm.
Yes, exactly. Like, you can't read The Color Purple, or I mean, ridiculous. ridiculous who can't read Harry Potter. I mean, these people are nuts. And of course, the right-wing legislators have a lot more power. And then on the far left, you've got similar problems, where you ban books.
You can't read To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes. Just ridiculous. I mean, just really ridiculous.
It's heartbreaking. And I think I have a foreigner's naivete about the U.S. as the Tocquevillian experiment, where you join in and you sign on the Bill of Rights. And that implies a lot of capacity for social political tensions and disagreements, but acceptance of them, importantly, and the lack of that, the decline of pluralism and its impact specifically on academic institutions. Those are where it's supposed to be at its highest ferment of intellectual debate and experiment. It's just I can't help but use the word again. Like, it's heartbreaking to me. But I'm sorry that I imposed that old viral moment.
Oh, that's okay. It's it's become part of my biography now. And so, sometimes people ask me and, I say what I can and we can move on.
Well, let's talk. I mean, let's talk about a little bit about your most recent book, Apollo's Arrow, on this theme of us, a divided society at present, and then enter COVID. When you were talking earlier about, like aliens coming down to the planet and being the outside force that should hopefully rally and dissolve the internal conflicts, I guess one of my questions to you is, why wasn't COVID that kind of force? Why wasn't it like the aliens coming down to the planet to get us in gear and to coordinate and cooperate towards a solution?
It's a very normal and natural question to ask. Why isn't this virus seen as an alien force that is bonding us together? Why aren't we united against a common enemy in the coronavirus? Well, you might or might not be surprised to hear that you're not the first person to have this thought about how shouldn't we unite to fight the germ. Here is because observers have long recognized that an epidemic might force people to see their common interest. And there was, in fact, a devastating plague in Rome in the 3rd century of the Common Era that was killing about 5,000 people a day. Rome was a huge city of over 1 million inhabitants. Just astonishing, actually. And there was an observer, Saint Cyprian, who I'm going to read something now that I happen to have handy. He said, "It disturbs some that this mortality is common to us with others. And yet what is there in this world which is not common to us with others? So long as we are here in the world, we are associated with the human race in fleshly equality." So Saint Cyprian, 1700 years ago, is articulating a variant of your question, which is, when we're under the shared threat, we're all dying from this germ. Couldn't we unite to fight the germ? So you're right to ask that question. And the answer is that, yes, it does. We do unite. There is cooperation. There are clearly ways in which we have used our capacity for cooperation and for teaching and learning, by the way. We've used our skills to fight the virus. And one of the ways I like to think about this, and this is some work we do in my lab, where we study the evolutionary origins and the mathematical structure and the social function of human social networks and human social interactions. You can think that the germ is following these network ties. It spreads from me to you, and from you to Adam, and from Adam to his partner, and it just keeps spreading, right? This germ is spreading across social ties. So you might want to think about the fact that the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. Earlier, we were talking about how we come together to share information, that the spread of ideas is such a fundamental feature of our humanity. But by coming near you in order to learn from you, I not only expose myself to risk of violence, you might beat me or steal from me, but I also expose myself to a risk of you might infect me with a germ. And so we've argued that natural selection has balanced these qualities, the costs and benefits to give rise to a structure of human social interaction, which is optimized. It says, on the one hand, you gain information when you go near Adam. On the other hand, or Vanessa, when you go near Vanessa, you you gain information. That's great, but you also get germs when you're Vanessa. So overall, how should you approach Vanessa or not? And should you form connections with how many people or not? And so
cost benefit.
So, but here's the thing: the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. But equally, it is the spread of ideas that will allow us to control the spread of germs, and the sharing of information and the working together. And this has been appreciated for hundreds of years. The Venetians during the bubonic plague invented quarantine to keep people offshore. They worked together to build these castles where incoming ships would have to spend 40 days to make sure they weren't carrying the plague and so on. Or now we're seeing with the invention of the vaccines. These vaccines, the reason we're able to fight back the coronavirus to any extent at all is that we are capable of cumulative culture. And thousands of scientists and tens of thousands of patients have willingly volunteered, have altruistically said, I'll sign up for the trial to help my fellow human being. These are these wonderful qualities that we have that will allow us to fight back the germ. So,
of course, if you share the Jared Diamond nostalgia, you could say that, well, all of this could have been prevented if we just did not exist in human civilization.
I wouldn't. Would you really describe his position as nostalgia? I wouldn't say that.
I think there's my take. There's an undercurrent of Rousseauian nostalgia and frustration with modern civilization. If only we had no farming, there would be no farm animals to give us diseases.
Yeah,
obviously, I don't think he's prescribing anything. But there is a touch of melancholy where humanity is gone.
It's fascinating to hear you with that take. And now, as soon as you offered that opinion, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. He is nostalgic. I don't know. But regardless of whether he's nostalgic, I mean, he's making sort of arguments that
are fascinating. Yeah, and everybody should read Guns, Germs, and Steel. Yeah.
After you read Blueprint and Apollo.
After you read Blueprint.
Exactly. Yes, I'm sorry, Vanessa. Did I answer your question? I don't know.
Yes. No, I think you did. I mean, the one thing that I think comes very clear from reading the book is that, the evolution of human society has been concurrent with the evolution of pathogens, and they exploit these very human universal tendencies in the way that we interact with each other, and in fact they are also evolving. I mean, you talk about the fact that they often evolve to be less lethal because that way they can kind of coexist with us much more happily.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, it still it still doesn't necessarily satisfy me that our response was so piecemeal and slapdash and
I think the virus struck us also at a particularly vulnerable moment in our history, at least in the United States, where we already had many political divisions. We had a political polarization that was at a high. We had economic inequality that is at a high. We had a thinning out of our intellectual life, a distrust of experts, a suspicion about science. We had all of these background features that had made it difficult for us as a society to soberly assess this threat and work together to confront it. And the virus, as a result, has killed many hundred thousands of extra Americans than it otherwise would have had we been able to get our shit together, candidly. And I think that is very unfortunate.
Yeah, the last thing you mentioned in the litany of woes is our mistrust or distrust of science connects to is this a collapse of our capacity to transmit knowledge? Whether it's the social media or just a new social pathogen that you see, at least in the U.S., when you see a person in a lab coat, you're thinking X-Files conspiracy theories rather than somebody who might have some knowledge to bequeath.
I don't know. There's I think societies wax and wane in their confidence in institutions. And in some sense, you could see science as an institution. Our confidence in our political leadership, or our confidence in our judiciary. Do we confidence in the police, confidence in the military, confidence in the priesthood, confidence in scientists? There are different institutions that serve different roles in a society. And societies wax and wane. And I think we are on the ebb right now of a lot of suspicion. We had the scandals in the Catholic Church. We have endless scandals with our politicians. We the new media environment means we don't have a kind of, whether he was rightly trusted or not, I'm not going to comment, but, there was Walter Cronkite, who everyone got their news and was seen as a sensible, middle of the road kind of honest figure, and now, everyone thinks, well, who knows what, that person is saying, what they want to say or whatever. So what I don't understand, and we're seeing that with the judiciary as well, where there's a kind of politicization of the judiciary and a kind of sentiment that, look, I was never so naive as to believe that judges were fully impartial, that judges were perfect, that judges were insulated from the broader society. But mostly I didn't think that in America we had a corrupt judiciary, right? I mean, there are other societies where you just pay the judge, you get the ruling you want. That was not our society. Or where the judge would
by and large,
exactly. By and large, yes, of course, there are exceptions, of course. Or that the idea that there'd be an independent judiciary in China is ridiculous, right? I mean, they're all members of the Communist Party and so on. So whereas in our society, I thought, okay, we have an independent, by and large, non-corrupt, judiciary, et cetera. When we begin to lose that, that's a problem for our society. When we lose either the perception of it or certainly the reality of it. Or the notion that, like, you'd be surprised how much of our economy runs on trust. You buy goods and you pay for them later. This is not the Middle Eastern bazaar model. In the bazaar, you're given the goods and you pay for them now. Plus, caveat emptor, you can't return the goods. Whereas in our society, it's the customer is king. You don't like a product after you paid for it, you can return it. This is a very specific feature of our society, and it's based on trust. That all this requires trust, which allows our economy to thrive in certain ways and supports innovation and everything else. So the scientists, it's odd to me what's happened with science. When once a year, when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court goes before Congress to advocate for funding for the federal judiciary, nobody sees that as a self-interested act, right? You don't think, there are those judges again wanting to feed at the public purse. They're just a corrupt bunch of people who want money for their own, special needs. No, we think that, we need a federal judiciary, and here's an honest reporter who's saying, we need this many judges and therefore this much money or whatever the ritual is. Well, it used to be, I think, that scientists were seen this way, when the scientists would come and they would say, this is, but now I think that, scientists are just seen as another interest group, feeding at the public trough. And I don't think, now I'm well familiar with the critiques of science. Of course, science is wrong. Science has been used and exploited. It has been a tool of oppression. I understand all of that. But in principle, in theory, this is not at all what science is about. And therefore, a more thoroughgoing suspicion of science, which ultimately has been one of the key paths to our security and our wealth, by the way, scientific innovation, is very ill-advised.
And the importance of perception in that sense, that's partially self-inflicted, and that's like part of Jonathan Rauch's argument about the liberal sciences. You're causing. When you have scenes like we just described in your YouTube incident, when you have scenes like that, it creates a perception, at least, that those institutions aren't really committed to that idea of the liberal scientific project, in which case, what is it that we're supporting as an institution?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Same with higher learning, like you're alluding to. Why is higher learning? It's unsustainable. There was just an article, something like the political tilt in the students and in the professors in these elite institutions is so lopsided now.
It's like almost like 40-1, something crazy.
It's crazy. It's not sustainable. How can, these institutions, the institutions of higher learning, rely on the public purse and the bequests of wealthy individuals. And you cannot have this extreme a tilt away from the kind of median voter for it to be sustainable. And you can't also represent that you are committed to one set of principles like free expression and then not honor them and not be therefore seen as a hypocrite and lose credibility in the broader public eye, which public eyes regard you need in order to endure. So, when you're no longer, if the military says, give us money and trust us, we're going to defend you. And then if they fail to defend you, you're like, whoa, your job is to defend us and you're not doing your job. Why should we give you money and confidence? And the same as if you're an academic institution, give us money and confidence, and we will be that portion of our society where there's a free exchange of ideas, that the mission of a university is the preservation, production, and dissemination of knowledge. That's our mission. And yet you see instead them becoming ideological or suppressing the dissemination of knowledge, then all bets are off, and you're not honoring your core mission. And I think that can subvert it. So there is a crisis of confidence, I think, right now. Now, this, just to be clear, there are ebbs and flows of this. It's not the first time in our society we've had like suspicion of scientists. But you're right, I think, to highlight that at this particular moment.
Final question. So, and we'll do it super quick. But we tend to ask our guests. We often ask them what are the blind spots that they see on the left and the right, since it's so difficult to be able to look at both sides of the political spectrum. But for you, we want to adapt to this question. We want to ask you, what do you think are the biggest blind spots in terms of scientific research? What are the things
that the scientific community
is not looking at that you think they should be?
Well, I mean, the scientific community is vast and engaged in all kinds of stuff. And I'm just a lover of science. I love everything. I love the people who study Sanskrit, and I love archaeology and
But presumably some blind spots affect you or cause you to lose sleep more than others.
Well, no, I could answer the question more in your customary way than I could in your refined way. For me,
Sure.
I mean, obviously I have my own parochial interest in what should be supported in terms of good science. And, if I were king and I could allocate research dollars, I would probably rejigger it a little bit. And let's say, spend more money on public health and more money on social science, more money on things that I study, So yes, I mean, I suppose that's true. But, I think both the right and the left denigrate science when it offers inconvenient truths. And on the right, you have climate change deniers, and you have suppression of gun epidemiology. They don't want any research done on the epidemiology of gun violence. You have many people on the far right, don't want to believe in, stem cell biology. They don't want that being done because of the connection to abortion or evolutionary biology. They don't want to believe in, natural selection or Darwinian. And on the left, you have people who reject that the behavior genetics, that genetics plays a role in human behavior, which is a preposterous position to take, or gender differences, for example, or in physical anthropology. I mean, on the far left, you have all kinds of anti-vax on the far left. Let's not forget, the anti-vax sentiment was usually a movement on the left, right? And lately, it's become a far right phenomenon. But for years, it was mostly a far left phenomenon. So, you have people on the left and the right who don't want to believe science when it's inconvenient for their ideology. And, I of course, I have my own political beliefs. I'm politically on the left, but that I believe is independent of my commitment to science. For example, on this issue of the origins of the coronavirus, I don't understand why this has become politicized. I don't have a commitment to whether it was a leak from a Chinese lab or it was a zoonotic leap. I think it's probably a zoonotic leap. If you look at the history of past such pathogens, if I had to guess, it's more likely than not that it was a natural, there was some event where someone had contact with a bat and then it came into human population. But it could have been a lab leak. Absolutely, it could have been a lab leak. And we don't have enough evidence to be sure either way right now. And I'm not happy is not the right word. I'm perfectly willing to accept whatever outcome ultimately is the case. Why on earth would I have a political commitment to this? This is stupid. It's like people who argue over things to which the answer is known. But just look it up. I mean, why would you argue? Just go to the dictionary or the encyclopedia or Wikipedia or look up the answer and stop arguing. So, we don't need to argue about this, and we will find the answer, and probably, not necessarily. I mean, the answer might never be known. And so I don't have a political stake in this matter, but now we're seeing the left and the right line up on opposite sides of this thing, which is just pointless and unnecessary, in my view.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We're Uncertain Pod on the social media. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or just share us with your friends and enemies. And until next time, stay sane.
I want to ask the Blindspots question.
So yes, that's the conclusion. So before we have our concluding question,
you want that to be the conclusion?
Yeah. I think it's a good ender. I hope.
Okay, we'll see.
This is like completely breaking the order of the conversation, but it's it is what it is. In Blueprint, you write a little bit about your idea of an exophenotype, which I guess is somewhat related to Richard Dawkins's hypothesis of the extended phenotype. So if you can please help guide us through this word salad that I'm making.
Yeah, I mean this notion of an exophenotype that I try to advance in Blueprint, it was one of the most exciting and also depressing moments of my scientific career because at the time when we had these ideas, I was working with my colleague James Fowler, and we had been thinking about the role of our genes in shaping our social networks. And I began to think about our networks, the spider's web as a metaphor for our networks, that the spider spins a web and we spin a social web. We rearrange the social world around us, and that our genes might play a role in how we arrange that social world, just like the genes of a spider shape the structure of the web that the spider constructs. So I'd had this metaphor in my mind, and we had, at the time, James and I had read about some work in psychiatric genetics, which began to think about psychiatric diseases as what were called endophenotypes. In other words, that inside your body, there was a phenotype, a kind of psychiatric disposition. You were anxious, let's say. It's not manifest on the surface of your body, but it's an endophenotype. Actually, this word has an older root in insect physiology. But anyway, and it suddenly dawned on me that we could think about the role of genes outside our bodies, and that we might have exophenotypes. In other words, genes might shape how we rearrange the social world around us. And I thought this was an amazing idea. And we began to really work hard on this idea and we published a whole bunch of papers that show that how you pick your friends and which friends you pick have been partially shaped by your genes and by natural selection. And very quickly, however, afterwards, I discovered, unsurprisingly, this is the depressing part, that Richard Dawkins had this similar idea, if not the same idea, like 20 years earlier in a magnificent book called The Extended Phenotype. Now, Richard's work was a work of theory, and he said there in his book, he talks, there's no evidence for this. Of course, in my lab, we were trying to adduce such evidence. And he was thinking about it in a different way. For example, his prototypic example is a beaver dam.
Beaver, yeah.
The beaver is programmed to make a dam, just like the beaver must make a tail of a particular flat, padding tail. And the dam is an extended phenotype, or what we would call an exophenotype. So that is the argument. The argument is that natural selection has shaped us to do these things outside our body. And the interesting thing about it is once we do those things outside our body, it can create a positive feedback loop with our evolution. Let me give you an example by reference to beavers. So for example, let's say beavers begin to evolve to build dams. And the reason beavers might build a dam is to expand the extent of shoreline available to them for foraging. If you dam a creek, you create a larger perimeter that you can now hunt for critters that you might want, or more trees that you could take down, or whatever. Incidentally, when you do that, you change the environment for other species like fish. Different kind of fish can now evolve. The beaver, have modified the environment, and you create a selection pressure on fish so that different kinds of fish evolve in environments where there are beavers that are damming creeks than environments where there aren't beavers that are damming creeks. But the interesting part about the beaver is that when the beaver creates the dam, it also creates a selection pressure not just on the fish, but on itself. In other words, now beavers with bigger lungs that can stay underwater longer can thrive and survive better if they build bigger dams. So over time, the beaver is inducing its own evolution. The lung evolution of the beaver is modified by the dam building behavior of the beaver. Of course, as the lungs of the beaver get bigger, now it can build bigger and bigger dams. So you get this feedback loop between what the beaver is doing outside its body and how the beaver is evolving inside its body. Well, I argue it's the same with humans, that as we begin to be cooperative or friendly, and we begin to reshape the social world around us, we create friendly worlds. And who thrives in friendly worlds? Friendly people is the argument. Now, of course, sociopaths can also thrive. This is discussed in the book. There are all these wrinkles, et cetera. But the gist of the story is we engage in something called niche construction, social niche construction. We create social worlds around us, which create the terrain for us to thrive. For example, you might have evolved, all of us might manifest an evolved tendency to seek out teachers. Why do you seek out teachers? Why do you feel good when you seek out someone who can teach you stuff? Well, those among us who seek out teachers may actually be more fit in a Darwinian sense than those of us who do not. And so you create an environment around yourself that's full of teachers, and one thing leads to another, and so on. There's a whole other argument we could have about the Ashkenazim, which we're not going to have right now, whole other conversations, which might interest you. The written word. If you create an environment in which people like the rabbis were very fecund, but the Catholic priests were not. So if you create an environment in which the ability to manipulate the written word is advantaged, you create the circumstances in which you modify the selection pressure on this. So these are other people's ideas, not my work. But anyway, so that's some of the arguments about an exophenotype. Now, just to be clear, the written word is not an exophenotype because there's no genes for printing press and no genes for writing. But I just threw in that example because I thought it might interest you.
There are genes for like our visual acuity, however, which could also be related and reinforced potentially. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I don't know why I threw
Well, no, I mean, the argument, I use that example because that's an example from the next chapter, which is gene culture coevolution, which is a similar but different idea from the exophenotype. When we invent lenses, that's not an exophenotype. Our technological capacities are not an exophenotype. That falls into the realm of gene culture coevolution. The idea here is because we invent the written word or we invent glasses, you and me, Vanessa, who are myopic, we would have been eaten by lions 10,000 years ago. But now, because of medieval lens grinders and the invention of glasses, we can survive and reproduce and have more myopic children. And so over time, human vision might decrease. The genes that give us bad eyesight or contribute to bad eyesight might become more common, the allelic variants, the genetic variants, not strictly the genes. Anyway, the allelic variants. And so we might all become progressively more myopic because of the invention of lens, of glasses. Now that's similar to, but different than the exophenotype idea in ways that I discuss in the book. The idea that what our cultural inventions could change the course of our evolution. And the most famous example of this is the domestication of milk-producing animals. So between 3,000 and 9,000 years ago, there were multiple times when human beings domesticated milk-producing animals: sheep, cattle, camels, cows, and so on, goats. And so we had a cultural innovation. We domesticated animals. That's a technological, scientific, cultural advance. And when we do that, we modify our environment because now there's milk in our environment. Prior to 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, there was no reason for any adult human to be able to digest milk because once you were weaned, you never saw milk again for the rest of your life. So you have an enzyme in your body called lactase that digests the primary sugar in milk, which is called lactose. And that lactase enzyme, which you need when you're a baby and you're suckling, actually wanes and disappears when you're a little child because you don't need it anymore. It'd be wasteful for your body, unnecessary from an evolutionary perspective for you to still be producing lactase when you're 10 or 20, right? So when you're weaned, 3 or 4, you stop producing lactase. But beginning between 3,000 and 8,000 years ago, we now suddenly produce milk. Milk is in our environment. So those among us who had mutations that allowed for the persistence of lactase into adulthood were more fit in a Darwinian way than those among us who could not eat milk, because now we had an extra source of nutrition available to us and an extra source of hydration. If the water was polluted, you would drink the water and die. But if I could drink milk, I would drink milk and survive because the milk is sterile. It doesn't have the things in it. So So this has led to the widespread distribution, not the uniform, but the widespread distribution of lactase tolerance, lactase persistence. And this is work that Sarah Tishkoff and others have done. And shown that, for example, these lactase persistence genes emerged in herding populations in Africa, but did not exist in hunter-gatherer populations, which didn't have a ready supply of milk. So this is an example of how culture can change our genes or can contribute to a change. The same, but incidentally, goes with the vaccines that we're using right now. So people who otherwise would have died from coronavirus are going to survive because of our vaccines. Medical technology is another example. So our invention of modern medicine is changing the course of human evolution, or climate change, our warming of the planet through our technology. The humans that are alive in 5,000 years will be different than the humans that would have been alive had we not warmed our planet. But these ideas of gene culture coevolution are different than the exophenotype. And the reason they're different is that there aren't any genes for making vaccines or making domesticating animals or doing those things, whereas there are genes for making friends. And so it's the difference between, like a snail has to make a shell, its house, and carry it with us. It has genes that guide the making of a house. We do not have genes that specify what kind of house we will make or that we must make a house.
Is it possible that some of the things that we assume aren't genetically required actually are, but just haven't had the environment allowing for it?
Yes, but that's a very long and difficult topic, which would require tremendous speculation. But yes.
But it is possible in theory.
Yes.
Presumably, we never had glasses making genes that was just waiting for us to figure out how to grind lenses. But maybe therein lies Spinoza.